You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varcoe, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years' experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Good to have you with us again. Well, interesting session this one's going to be. Earlier this year in 2024, the Canadian government had a 5-year review done on their cannabis legalisation policy and practices. And even that less than objective evaluation was not complimentary. Today's guest has had a very intimate and at times very distressing engagement with that journey and a prominent advocate opposing this community unravelling legislation. And it is that. Pamela McColl is a Vancouver-based educator, activist and author who earned her stripes in long and arduous battle against cannabis legalisation in Canada. Her 2 books on cannabis policy were just some of the important outcomes of this public health champion, working with policymakers and politicians advocating evidence-based science into the Canadian Parliament, as well as challenging the faux narratives of the highly cashed-up addiction for profit cannabis lobby and their political allies, and there are many. I've met some of them. One such successful fight saw her targeted for scathing attacks when she successfully advocated for the shutting down of a particularly egregious study funded by the US Department of Health and recruited women who were both pregnant and ongoing users of marijuana products. For 6 months, she investigated this study, alerting the many, including the national media and White House, on the wrongdoings of this fatally flawed and corrupt research. As you can imagine, this robust and vital advocacy did not make her any friends in that space. Interrupting the political and fiscal goals of this addiction-for-profit industry saw her severely attacked and paid a heavy personal cost in this brave journey. And it was that indeed. Pam has been part of a broad-based international coalition of voices calling out legalisation as the wrong approach to drug policy and has been working with others for over a decade, sharing information, assisting with research and sharing her voice and that of others engaged in this vitally important discussion. Pamela McColl, welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I've spoken to you many times on the phone and email. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, it's good to have the face-to-face and value deeply your contribution to this really concerning issue, and of course, as we see it, unraveling and unpacking. Before we jump into some of the details around this and some of your journey, important journey, I think it'd be good to our listeners to have a little bit of a background of who Pam is. Just something, I don't know. Tell us about where you live. I think
Sure.
I've heard so much about Vancouver, and obviously some of from a drug policy perspective, I see it through that lens, and I find it very unattractive. But everyone I talk to that's been there or visited there has gone, wow, this is a great space. So tell us a little bit about where you live and what's it like for you to live there.
Well, sure. I'm from Vancouver. I was born here. I went to university in other places, but I'm a 4th-generation Vancouverite. And to see the city sort of turn into a, drug sort of population. I mean, every single street, all the hospitals, it's very sad to see. But I am a book publisher primarily. I've been doing it for 20 years. And I was in New York at the United Nations, and I was at a book festival. And I picked up a book about marijuana policy. And I threw it in my luggage to bring back home to a friend of mine who's a judge who I knew had an interest in marijuana policy. And on the plane, I read the book.
Wow.
And I was so upset by seeing the repeat of big tobacco. And I thought, this is terrible. How could we possibly begin this again? Because I had worked in tobacco prevention for a long time. I'm sort of infamous around the world for being the person that got Santa Claus to quit smoking. In 2012, I took the pipe out of the famous poem, 'Twas Night for Christmas.
Yeah.
And I ended up on Stephen Colbert, the Colbert Report, and a spoof, and on NBC Nightly News. In Australia, it was covered in Brisbane and China and India. It was a big story. It went all over the world, and so I was, because it was tobacco, right? So when I came back to Vancouver, on this flight with this book, I, pass it off to my friend who's a judge, and I didn't really want to work on marijuana policy. I didn't know very much about it. And then I was so angry and just so perturbed that we would repeat the mistakes of tobacco that I did get involved. And Patrick Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's nephew and Ted Kennedy's son, was coming to Vancouver. And so they reached out to me and asked if I put together some events, which I did. And there was an ABC Australia news crew there doing a documentary called Cannabis Inc. And so I got in touch with the producers, and they said, we want to do an event with Robert Kennedy, and we need these sort of parameters, and we need these things to happen. And so I staged a luncheon, and I staged a few other events.
Beautiful.
And we did Cannabis Inc. And Susan Smith was the person who produced that for ABC Australia. It's a wonderful film. It's very important.
Yes,
and I think it really.
It's all the data I've looked at over the last 10 years, it's in the back of my head. And it was a good documentary. It's a good documentary.
What it did was it sent up these flags that the marijuana industry was being funded and supported by very, very big people like the Peter Thiels of this world, but also by the people who market Starbucks and other huge global brands were involved in the marketing of this thing. One thing just happened, I'll just share it with you. Yesterday, I was watching the news, and I follow the stock market like we all do, I guess. And there was two business reporters were saying, why are cannabis stocks up? Is there any news? And there wasn't any news. And they said, there's no news. We've been looking for the news. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And so then I was looking that at 12 noon Pacific time, 3 o'clock Eastern time, Donald Trump announced his VP pick, J.D. Vance, whose chief benefactor is Peter Thiel.
Wow. Okay.
So I went and looked at the charts of the cannabis stocks, and they went straight up, 12%, exactly noon, 12 o'clock on that announcement. So, the links between cannabis legalization and big business and politics is incessant. It's woven into not only the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, but they've bought senators, and I mean, it's just it's really fascinating to see that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it is Pam, as you intimated, it's basically a repeat of Big Tobacco 2.0. Oh, it's Big Tobacco 2.0. Yes. It's a repeat of the strategy.
Right? They've got these, they've look at Nancy Pelosi. I mean, it's just it goes on and on. Especially in Canada, it's the same thing, right?
Well,
so
just recall dealing with one of our DART team members, our reference group and our scientific reference group, and for the Delgado Institute, lives in Colorado and is an emergency medicine doctor. You both know her, Karen Randall, and she's a
wonderful person.
Wonderful person. She's on our team, and we had an interview with her and on the podcast. It was a great interview, and we encourage our listeners to go and, if you have not heard it already, go back and have another look at that. But the thing that was fascinating for her is that she was saying that for every, anti, if you like, cannabis lobbyist like yourself, an advocate in the marketplace in Colorado, there was 100 on their Capitol Hill in Colorado doing their thing, and it's like cashed up, and of course the playbook is very clear. And so again, there's no doubt here that it's almost an identical repeat of Big Tobacco, and that's why it's called Big Tobacco 2.0, because it is just that, and you've experienced it firsthand. Look, now you've intimated some of the your starting points for this, and I'm really fascinated by that. And one of the things I was going to ask you, and you sort of partly answered that, was 2012 was kind of when you, well, according to what I'm looking at and our connection, at 2012 you started pushing back into this space because of that. Now, the tobacco issue obviously clearly informed your advocacy, because you're an advocate against this, clearly shocking public health wrecking ball called tobacco, and cannabis is just going to be add another layer to that again and actually amplify that damage. But what, besides the Big Tobacco and reading this book, was there any other catalyst for you that said the heads up other than the book that you actually picked up at that particular event?
Yes. When I was 17 years old and went to university, I wanted to write for children's television. because I
Right.
felt that it was sort of the age when Sesame Street was coming on, and I really felt there was too much violence on TV. And I'm first and foremost a child's rights activist. I'm much more so than a drug preventionist. I really
Well,
believe we need to protect children.
you cannot be one without the other. I believe that sincerely.
True,
Keep
true.
going. Sorry.
And so I really wanted to work on something like that. And so when I came along and took away the pipe from Santa and I had a platform for protecting children from secondhand smoke, right? Based on all we know, marijuana to me was an attack on our children. And so it's quite different for an adult to tell another adult what they can and cannot do if it's a legal product. I don't go around telling people not to smoke. I mean, they like to portray us as, these horrible monster people who go around, being rude to people who smoke pot or do pot or smoke cigarettes. I've never told someone to not smoke in my life. That's not what I'm about.
No.
I'm all about just protecting our children.
Yeah.
That my personal opinions of someone who smokes are my opinions. And I might mutter to myself how pathetic I think it looks. But it's really about children. And so when Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, came along and said, I was driving along in my car in Vancouver, and I heard him say, I'm going to legalize marijuana because it's no worse than tobacco or alcohol. That is an obscenely rude thing to say. Given the number of people that die from tobacco, 28% of the people who die from secondhand smoke are infants or children.
It's a breathtaking ignorant statement. Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, I'm going to do it because it's no worse than tobacco or alcohol. What a ridiculous thing, an irresponsible thing to say, given the amount of damage alcohol causes and tobacco and marijuana. And so I think it was really my sort of disdain for Justin Trudeau's opinion on this. And I could see past what he was saying into his agenda. He was trying to capture votes by appealing to people and looking hip and cool with his groovy hair. And it just was also facade-y and so superficial. And it really bothered me. And that's when I started getting onto radio shows and talking about it and writing and sort of getting a group together and reaching out to MPs. And that's what I did. I mean, I started working on the anti-legalization campaign well before it went to the House of Commons and the Senate. But then, as we go forward here in this conversation, as I get into the House of Commons and the Senate and started writing speeches for members of Parliament and people and advocating for certain speakers like Stuart Rees and Dr. Stuart Rees and people, I really picked up steam. And I was very, very influential. And I got a lot of slack.
Absolutely. We'll get into that a bit later on because I want to sort of unfold this kind of journey. Now, again, your remarkable book, outstanding book, The Pied Pipers of Pot, Protecting Youth from the Marijuana Industry, which is a key factor and element in what you do and why you do what you do, which you've just indicated, which is fantastic. And we're in the same boat, advocating for the rights of the child, and is a key element of what we do. And we've got a number of platforms that sponsor that. But your book, it's interesting. The research really started around 2012, and by 2017, before it was actually legislated before as being legalized, which was 2018, you spent 5 years collating, developing, and collecting data, which was quite scathing and quite damning of the product. And even now, we've got more data that's just layered upon layered, and the science is now catching up with the absolute atrocity that is cannabis. But I'm fascinated by the fact that, and by the way, we've included now your at least 5 chapters in this particular work as required ready for our students in our training program, which is going to be released in the next 6 to 12 months. So it's really important reading, because what it does is it looks at again being a change agent in your community, which is part of what we're doing is developing this training program, and what that looks like. So it's not just about the content of your book, but the way you went about it. So very important for anyone who's interested in advocacy out there listening to this, and what it looks like to advocate for public health against, and particularly in an environment that's hostile. This work's actually very, very good.
I'll tell you a little story. I'll just tell you a little story quickly.
Yeah, sure.
This book was what was in my head, right? So it's like my filing cabinet in my head. And sometimes you have to get it out because I needed the book as much as anybody, because I needed to have it easy.
You're going to burst if you don't get it out, Yeah,
and plus all these files everywhere and stuff everywhere. And I love connecting dots, and sort of bring it all together. But I I had all my notes, and I was getting serious death threats. I had law enforcement giving me their private cell phone numbers and stuff. They were scared for me, and it was scary. It was rough. And I remember thinking this book was, and I don't know if you've ever written a book, but books are really hard to write.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of, I was traveling
I've
in
written
London.
too. I know what it's like. It's tough
yeah,
going.
right. And you're in your head and you're just trying to figure it all out. And you know what I did? I burnt all my notes once.
Oh, wow.
I lived on a 18 acre farm, and I went outside and I burnt everything.
Okay. Tell us about that, the motivation behind that.
I was like, too hard. This is too scary. This is ridiculous. And then you know what I had to do? I had to write the book. So I had to go get all everything again. It's like, yeah, sometimes it's like, I often tell my friends who get really exasperated by this work and want to quit, and they they do the little dance, they get all upset, right? And they don't want to do this. Don't want to hear from anybody. Don't send me any. But once you have the bite, and once you know as much as we know, sorry, but you're in this for life, because you have this much knowledge and this much passion and this much interest, and you've seen this much damage to people close to you possibly, that you can't quit. And I tried a few times, and I always say, take a break if you're burnt out, but you can't really quit because you're too valuable. Like, so much that we need you. So go take a break. Like Karen Randall's had burnout days, I'm sure. I know she has.
Yeah.
But when you're needed and you know more, you know so much, you have to stay in the game. It's rough.
Yeah, and I get it. We're going to unpack that a little bit further down the line on this in this time together, Pam, because that is an important thing. And I'm glad you've broached it so transparently, because it is incredibly tough. I've been in this particular sector and in this particular role in a alcohol and other drug education and advocacy space. And I tell you what, the education space I enjoy, I value. It can be tough, but the advocacy, that's the killer. That's when you're educating from the top down, government down, and policymakers, and then the pushback, and then you become engaged in adversarial contestations that sometimes you didn't even see coming. Obviously, there's some clear signs that you're going to step into the lion's den, as it were, and you get that, and you kind of go in there braced and ready. But sometimes you get blindsided by some of the people and some of the actors that you go, where did that come from? And wow, I did not see that coming. And it may not necessarily be a scathing attack, but an undermining enterprise or an undermining series of statements and ideas and positions that you really didn't see this group having. And you're going, where the hell did that come from? Well,
look what happened to Dr. Stuart Rees.
Yeah.
I was in charge of coming up with a list of people that the Conservative Party of Canada could call to the House of Commons Committee of Health. And it was the Liberals, because they're in power, had this many people, and the committee was chaired by a Liberal. So we had to get through this committee, but the Conservatives were entitled to a number of speakers, right? Yeah. So I thought about this, and I put down Dr. Stuart Rees.
Yep.
Well, Dr. Stuart Rees called me up one day and said, I just got an email. They've accepted me to speak for 8 minutes in the House of Commons of Canada on this issue. I was like ecstatic. Because it would be the media, it would be the whole House of Commons would hear that. Everybody would hear what Stuart Rees was going to say about DNA damage and reproductive health issues in marijuana.
Genotoxicity of cannabis, and it's fully entrenched in the research.
We get very few breaks right here, right? Yeah. We get very few breaks. And then he called me up, I guess it was a week later, and he said they uninvited me. They took him off the list.
Yeah.
They said they didn't have enough room for him. And yet they called somebody else, Donna Larson, who was high at the time. And one of the ministers of the government said to him, are you high right now? And he said, yes, and I'll be high when I leave. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's who they replaced Dr. Stuart Rees with. Yeah. So those kind of demoralizing blows, right?
Yeah.
Or somebody like in the Senate lying to your face.
Yeah.
Lying to your face, it's been there's lots of challenges and very few wins.
Hey people, just wanted to give you a heads up about a fantastic podcast you should check out. Pathways to Prevention is an inspirational podcast about the best practice journey of substance use prevention and many of the key factors that just make life work better. For in-depth, engaging and exceptional interviews and content, just search Pathways to Prevention podcast. That's pathways, number 2, prevention, and check it out. Now back to unnecessary harm.
Well, I think
few wins.
That's an important thing. And again, Professor Reese is also incidentally part of our DART think tank as well. And and we, for those who are regular listeners to our podcast and obviously chimed into our platforms online, our various platforms, already know that Dr. Reese, Professors Reese and Hulse from the WA University, as well as Professor John Toombaroo from Deakin University. We all presented at the United Nations C&D last year, 2023, on the genotoxicity and neurotoxicity of cannabis. And it was a bit of a seminal presentation because a lot of, certainly the UNODC had not had this kind of presentation in play. And at that stage, there was about 16 already published, peer-reviewed, published research documents on this incredible insight into the harms of cannabis. And it was interesting, the UN and UNODC were kind of like, oh, okay, wow, blah, 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 blah. And that was on the record now. And again, they because of our ECOSOC status, we were able to get into those sessions and deliver this research quite profoundly. Of course, the bad actors in the sector came out and talked, reefer madness and all this kind of stuff. They just throw out the one-liners and the memes. But it's interesting to watch the assault that even Stuart Reese has had, both internally and externally, from because he's also a medical doctor. He's got a practice, and he's one of the largest rehabilitative clinics in Queensland, and his work is phenomenal. He's not just an activist against this product; he's actively in play, helping people exit substance use, and that's an incredible testament to the man's involvement in this area. The compassion, the capacity of Stuart is remarkable, and to have him bumped by a stoner, literally bumped by a stoner, which is a reflection of the I think the Trudeau government in that context. What's interesting is
they found out what he was going to say, and they didn't want to hear it.
Correct, exactly. Because Stuart is is Mensa, absolutely Mensa, in his capacity. But
I know.
And his research is, again, it's peer reviewed and published in some of the best journals going, and there's dozens of research papers on this.
But I don't know if you want to talk about the House of Commons. What happened? I mean, it was a terrible situation. I mean, they rolled right over the Rights to Child Treaty.
Yep.
We were instrumental in that thing coming together when it was first drafted and ratified by every single country in the world except the United States and one other country. I mean, they rolled right over it, and they lied. I mean, they put people in the Senate who lied. I mean, and then I testified for 6 hours, and the former Minister of Health of our government, who was the chair of the task force, after me going through 6 hours of massive abuse, actually, in front of I think there were 3 or 4 ministers of the government and the head of Health Canada. I mean, major meeting. I was called to testify. Why they called me, I don't know, but they actually gave me the wrong address of the wrong hotel, but I figured it out and managed to get myself there.
Wow.
So, right? But she came up to me as I was leaving. I was supposed to be 7 hours, but I said, I think I'm done. I think I've said everything I need to say. I've put in my 17 inches of documents on the public record, and I think I've done my thing here. And this is the former Minister of Health of the Canadian government, head of the task force on cannabis legalization. She's turned to me and she said, just so you know, I just sealed the meeting and no one will ever see or hear anything you just did or said. That's what she did. She was so threatened by what I did, she sealed the meeting. I went to my MP and I said, this is what she said to me. Can you please check this out? And she came back to me and said, she sealed it forever. They'll never see what you did. Because what I did, and I still stand by this, and I think it's the strongest thing we have, any of us, is that the Canadian government in Health Canada has a document, I'm sure you've seen it, and it's a consumer alert on cannabis products. And it says, there's a list, no one under the age of 25, no one mental health issues, substance abuse issues, all these things. And it has a line, and the line is, men should not use if they wish to have children.
Yeah.
Case closed.
Yeah.
Sorry, case closed. How do you, and that's what I said, the first thing I said in that meeting with all these people, I was the only person there on my side. Everybody else was a pot person. And that was the first thing I said. I looked her straight in the eyes with her lawyer beside her and Health Canada beside her. And I said, how do you legalize a drug when you yourselves recognize this statement in your own government documents? How do you do that without getting sued down the road? How do you do that? And you know what she said to me was, she turned around and said, we're not here to discuss if, we're here to discuss how.
Wow.
So she didn't, I mean, I had everything. I had all the
Yeah,
JAMA. I mean, I had,
of course.
but anyway, it was very corrupt. But I mean, I'm sure you're interested in going forward what happened, but it was so corrupt. There were so many things that happened. But what's been very, very sad for me to see is that once the party was over, once legalization was over, or it had happened, and
Yes.
everybody, just sort of settled down to getting the the regulations in place and getting the pot shops open, all these things, the pot lobby went back, and all the little, provisions we went in there for signage or for warnings on labels or packaging or advertising, all the limits that we sort of were able to sort of, appease a few people by adding in there. I mean, we as in the government, they sort of appeased, they took them all out.
Yep.
They took them all out because nobody's paying attention anymore. Once you're legalized, everybody's gone.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. Nobody's here for it. Oh, now it's legalized. Yeah. Well, now we have beer with marijuana with alcohol and products.
Yeah. Yep.
Now we have the limits, or the advertising's changed. The warnings have changed. Like, they're just in charge, and nobody is. We have very weak opposition, so it's gone.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that too, because I think that's the unfolding. Then we had that incredible work that you developed over 5 years. Then you deployed it into the marketplace, as you've just said, shockingly. And anyone who's got any sense of objectivity and is listening to this particular podcast, if you're a pothead, you're a stoner, look, it's like, Yahoo, we won, whoopee-doo for us. But any objective person looks at this and listens to this and goes, what the hell? How did this happen? And of course, I still remember it's a bit of a side issue, but we had and I'm not going to mention names, I think you'll know who this is. We had a senator in Canada, come out to Australia to talk about their inside injecting rooms. And he was talking about how successful they were, and that we should have more of them. And of course, they weren't successful. The science on that was clearly evident, but they were just burying that as well. And I remember asking him a question about it, saying, well, this is such a great enterprise. How many people have exited drug use as a result of the injecting rooms? And he said 600. I said, wow, 600. Well, why isn't that anywhere in your literature? So those people no longer now inject drugs. He went, I didn't say that. And I went, so are they still using drugs? Next question, please. So there's absolutely zero drug using exiting from these platforms. But the interesting thing here that I found, I did some checking on this particular senator. He was also a chief stakeholder in one of the biggest marijuana companies vying for legalization of cannabis in Canada. And this is the whole part of the deal. So again, this whole faux harm reduction is a viable and a necessary component that when it's done for the purposes of helping people exit drug use, but it's been hijacked by the pro-drug activists. And now it's seen as a vehicle to manipulate and to keep people and normalize drug use. So we see harm reduction now as a failed policy. Now, the interesting thing...
They knew it was failed policy in 1910.
Of course they did. But what I'm saying is that, yes, they brought it back on the table. But my point being is that...
sorry.
No, so my point being is that they're all in the same boat. It's not about not about dealing with drug harms. It's about normalizing drug use. It's all about normalizing it. So it becomes, again, as we've seen with alcohol and tobacco, it's just part of the culture. And look, we will manage the damage as we move forward because the damage is really limited and it's manageable. But of course, as we've seen with big tobacco and now we're seeing with big alcohol, that's not the case. And now we want to add another psychotropic toxin to that mix and pretend it's not going to cause harm. It's just insane. Well, and you're now experiencing that insanity live and in play.
Well, the whole reason that this whole thing got off the ground was they played at our compassion. They called it the Compassion Act in California in 1996, right? The whole idea was it's compassionate to allow people to use drugs that aren't scientifically proven for medical conditions, to use them for medical conditions. It was a ruse. It's an absolute Trojan horse. And so, but they played us as the compassion, and then they played us as draconians, right? Like, because we're old Spidey Duddies or something, then they came across like big pharma, and then they came across. So it's been a game. But I think one of the most conniving, or conniving is the right word, I think, is the word normal. I mean, that
Yeah.
was the gold standard for tobacco prevention.
Mm,
Denormalization was how we curbed tobacco. We denormalized the industry. We made them the
correct.
villain, not the person who uses, but the industry.
Correct.
And it was called denormalization. It was a brilliant campaign started in Florida, and it is the gold standard of drug prevention. So
Hmm.
what happens in the United States? The Drug Policy Alliance, George Soros and the senator from Canada, these people sat around and what did they call the number one marijuana lobby group? Normal.
Yeah, of course.
They beat us at our own game before we could get them.
Yeah.
So how do you denormalize something that they've just normalized? So their
Yeah.
entire they knew the threat was denormalization. And so they had to come up with something. And it's brilliant.
Yeah.
They're always one step ahead of us, right? I mean, they
Yep.
were trying to say that marijuana was good for COVID. They're always one step ahead of us. They're always like the minute you say, "Oh, you shouldn't use if you're pregnant," they have lactation cookies. Like,
Yep. Yeah.
right? They're always one step, or they have, I mean, they have like just they're so good at this and
Yeah.
playing us for absolute fools and manipulating us.
Yeah,
It's
but
just
I think
outrageous.
yeah, it is that right. But jumping
Outrageous.
in on that, I think that this is the principle of what they call manufacturing consensus. I mean, Berkeley Institute, Berkeley University,
Mhm.
you know, sort of Professor Emeritus, which he's well known, Noam Chomsky. You know, he at first coined the phrase manufacturing consent, and he talked about specifically going after media and his version of media. But manufacturing consensus is a key factor in normalizing anything. And what it is grabbing hold of the public, the public microphone. That's the idea. And once you get the microphone and you're using these one-liners, these memes, and you introduce that narrative into the marketplace first, that's the key issue. Then you're always playing catch up. But the thing about and I think Mark Twain, you could probably correct me on this, Pam, as a seasoned author. Mark Twain, who said a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has even got its boots on. And so the problem is that all these things are true. These campaigns, these propaganda, but the very nature of propaganda itself is to present that which is fallacious and erroneous in a way that's palatable for the consumer and get it in the marketplace. And people buy the verbiage and they think, oh, this is
Right.
working for me. And that's why the tweet and social media has been so dangerous. The old we have a saying this. It used to say the pen was mightier than the sword. Now we say 140 character tweet is mightier than 10,000 evidence-based journal documents. So again, we've got this narrative in play in the community that's easy to manipulate. However, in that despairing monologue I've just delivered, the truth still does come out. Unfortunately, the truth is always slow to pick up because the truth is usually unsavory. It goes against people's innate broken desires to engage in whatever they think is fun or good or right for them. But once it's in play, then it starts to shift. Now, it's interesting. I want to get into this 5-year review of the policy that the Canadian government's just done. But it's interesting, I think, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but when thalidomide was introduced into the market, the American FDA said no, we're not going to use this. Australia said yes. Miracle drug for morning sickness, right? Now, we've just finished in the last 3 or 4 years of final class actions against thalidomide and the harms done by that. This is going to happen with tobacco. That is a guarantee. With cannabis. It's guaranteed. Unfortunately, it's the tragedy here is you're going to have almost 2 or 3 decades of carnage before this actually comes out. And, of course, the intergenerational harms that the genotoxic nature of this substance does is going to keep repeating. And that's where Stuart Rees's and Rees and Holst and others' research has been so important and so buried because these are the ramifications that are going to be unfolding soon. But this 5-year review, I want to jump in on that and we can revisit some of the incredible atrocities. I don't use the word atrocities in a so-called free democratic society where opinion and right to a voice is protected by law to see kind of the abuses that you've suffered. But I want to have a quick look at the review because after 5 years, so you spent 5 years actively lobbying and as a as a seasoned activist, as a known lobbyist, as a successful lobbyist against the anti-tobacco. So you weren't some sort of random that came out of nowhere and started, ranting and raving. You were actually a seasoned advocate who had credibility in the marketplace. They took you on that. Obviously, they engaged with you, and then they decided to excise your contribution because they didn't like it. But so after 5 years of doing that, now you've lived with 5 years of the Canadian policy, and you've indicated some of the junk that's already tapping. But I want to just unpack this. And the 5-year review of the Canadian cannabis experiment policy was released earlier this year, and we're going to do a little bit of a quick dive into it. Now, it's been a qualified success, according to the pot pundits holding the microphone of public discourse. However, just to give our listeners a small taste of what success looks like, I want to read just 3 of the panel's recommendations. And this is only around the youth factor. Before we hear these, I want to frame it with a bold direct declaration by the cannabis lobby before the legalization happened. If you legalize cannabis, usage will unlikely increase, particularly among the young. And I'm quoting, right? Now, recommendation 2 from Health Canada. Health Canada should set and monitor targets for reducing youth and young adult cannabis use and cannabis-related harms. Right there. The recommendation screams failure. And it's recommendation number 3. Health Canada should redouble. So if you did nothing in the first place, redoubling is 0 times double 0 is nothing. Anyway, so Canada Health should redouble its efforts to inform Canadians about the potential risks to children that can arise from accidental exposure to cannabis products, irrespective of the product's origin, and provide evidence to consumers on where and how to store cannabis safely. Recommendation 4, and the last one I'll just put on the table here. Health Canada should take a leadership role, working in collaboration with provinces and territories to support and develop an implementation of evidence-based school prevention programs and other interventions to reduce the prevalence of youth cannabis use. Federal, provincial and territorial governments should consider committing a portion of cannabis revenues, which are declining, to fund evidence-based public health interventions, including prevention programs for young and young adults. Now, just there, it's just breathtakingly, the cognitive dissonance does my head in. It's like, and again, if anything that you had been talked about prior to this and your work and your advocacy in the parliament had actually not been sealed and listened to, and then this a lot of this stuff would have been in play in the first place. In fact, I don't think they would have legalized it. But just going back to your statement before, it's interesting how they you're seeing the basically once they're in power, the legislation's in play, the rules are gone. They're just the packaging's changed, everything like that. So now you've said that before. The packaging changed because the lobby, the industry got in and said, "Look, let's just get rid of all these little regulations." Yeah. Now, this after 5 years, they're saying, "Hang on, guys, we need to revisit. Well, not we need to revisit this. We need to have this in play." But it was in play, and they took it out, and now they're saying, "Bring it back." So, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, plus nobody reads those kind of documents. Nobody cares. Everyone just thinks it's legalized. Nobody cares about the details, the vast population. We're going to have a change of government. Trudeau is despised. He's going around with 8 armored cars everywhere he goes. He didn't even go to the Calgary Stampede. It's a big thing in Alberta because he's too frightened. Yep. He's too frightened to quit because he'll lose his security detail. That's how scared this man is. And no board will have him. So he's kind of a lost wonderment at this point. But when he is gone, which I think he shall go soon, we will have a new Conservative government, hopefully, and he will get rid of all safe injection sites. He's already said that. That's gone. He's going to defund the CBC, our national media, who are just completely woke and out of touch. And he's been to Vancouver many times, and he has a real concern about the drug issues. So, they're not going to repeal legalization, but hopefully it's part of a much bigger movement here. As far as like the whole woke, the whole sort of undermining of our academics and our schools and our universities through ideology versus science. And, it's been going on since the 1970s in North America. They've planted people, with an agenda, political and disruptive, I would say, into universities to breed this new sort of generation or generations of people who think the way they do. And part of this is definitely the drug policy people who are coming out, who are now in positions of political power in places.
Yeah.
So to weed, as in all these issues, to weed these people out and to get new people into universities who teach properly and to use science as their basis and not ideology, and to reduce harm reduction and to put it where it belongs, in the garbage pan, because it's a failed ideology. It is an ideology. Even when Trudeau was legalizing marijuana, they said in the documents it would be evidence-based.
Clearly
He
not.
changed the language.
Yeah.
Evidence influenced or something. They couldn't use evidence-based. They knew they couldn't. They changed the second word in the documents.
Yep.
So, but I was just going to say, we have, I keep track of this. It's on the NIH Reporter of the United States government. There have been 11,000 studies done on marijuana to date, 11,000 studies at a cost of $4.3 billion. And they still don't have the study with the efficacy to have the FDA approve it for any medical condition. What does this tell us? What does this tell us? It will never be legal. It will never get medical status, the THC plant. It's like saying that we would have willow trees as a legal medicine. We don't use willow trees. We use aspirin. This is what people have to understand. You can study this thing to the ends of the earth.
Yep.
It will never be a medicine.
And
that's impossible.
Yeah,
it has 400 components in it.
Correct.
That's not how we do modern medicine. We isolate, like they have Sativex and Meridol and Dronabinol and Epidiolex.
Yeah, of course. They're symptom abating.
But we will never, ever. And so when these people say, "Oh, we just need more studies," that is absolute garbage, right?
Yes.
Not only do we have 11,000 studies with 4.3 million spent, nothing has been dissuading us from studying marijuana. It's been legal in the state of California since 1996.
That's right.
Plus they have federal plants and everything else. So that's ludicrous. But people need to understand that it will never be a medicine. That's an impossible idea.
Well, it's interesting because that's the thing we talk about in our platforms. Is because I just presented to a group of elderly business. I don't know if you have it in Canada. It's called Probus. It's an international club national club, international club that is retired business people that get together. Now we're looking at cannabis because the aging aging adult population is now starting to engage more and more to their detriment. But one of the things that we talk about now in our presentations is what so-called pharmaceutical grade cannabis is available, and they're on our PBS here, our public prescription benefits. I'm going to misrepresent it here. PBS anyway. It is basically Sativex has been there for about 25, 30 years. Again, now Epidiolex, which was developed by GW Pharma, now been taken over by Jazz Pharmaceutical, which was a proper, if you like to use, a proper pharmaceutically trialed version of Charlotte's Web, which was the cancer that came out of Colorado.
With very low efficacy. Well, again, and also very big side effect profile.
Yeah, 13 years. 13 years of. This is why I want our listeners to get this. I want to understand this. GW Pharma, and we take our hats off to them. $1.3 billion they spent. 13 years developing this particular derivation of a cannabis-based medicine and they called it Epidiolex. Now, it was created specifically for epilepsy medicine-resistant versions of epilepsy, including Dravet syndrome epilepsy. So really nasty stuff, right? So they worked really hard, did the science, the full pyramid of pharmaceutical trials, not the halfway pyramid that now the cannabis industry uses, which now our country has given them basically a free pass to go halfway. They don't have to do full clinical trials. They just have to go halfway, and they basically run off anecdote. And now they can be prescribed by our cannabis medicine people here in Australia. There's a lot of caveats around that. If things go pear-shaped, it's on the provider and it's on the practitioner who's prescribed the medicine. But anyway, GW Pharma, getting back to them, really important. All that money was spent, and they created a thing with a product it's a fourth line treatment. right? So there's 3 others are ahead of it that are better than it for this particular issue. However, it does have a place and it has a 25% efficacy. So yes, low efficacy, you're right, 4th line treatment, but at least they did the proper science. Now, this is the best we can do from a plant which has been so highly engineered and manipulated for so long. There's no such thing as natural plant anymore. For so long, and it's been so manipulated. Now, we've had, I can go back to, as you said, back to the 70s, where they were touting the panaceic capacity of marijuana then. This is the cure-all for all problems. Now, we've had 50 years of research, as you've said beautifully, 11,000 studies and $4.3 million worth of research.
Billion.
Sorry.
Billion.
And
No,
what
I
we've
think
got
it's
for
billion.
that, the billion. Yeah. So what we've got for that is no curative capacity, no curative properties, purely symptom abatement, symptom alleviation products. And I'm not, please hear me, for those listening who have got kids with Dravet syndrome, epilepsy, who are using the product and their seizures are being dealt with because of that, kudos and important. We know there's going to be side effects of that, but I understand that. That's proper pharmaceutical grade, science-based medicines. But again, there is zero curative capacity of this. And what is breathtaking is that now we're seeing the placebo effect of cannabis becoming greater and greater because, again, propaganda around this is so strong and people are believing things and they feel better, but they're only getting worse. They feel better, but they're only getting worse. They feel better, but they're only getting worse. And we've argued that you should harness the placebo effect, get rid of the cannabis from the equation and literally sell the placebo effect to help people deal with whatever they're dealing with.
I think the placebo was 13% on Epidiolex, but the side effect profile of that is pretty scary. Liver function, liver enzymes, and suicide ideation and activation. How many people in their 60s who are drinking alcohol and doing cannabis for sleep know that they should maybe have their liver checked and that if they're having suicidal thoughts, it might be the cannabis?
Correct.
This is the part that's so scary, right? They're using it for sleeping. Whoa. That's like saying you smoke for stress. Oh, excuse me. There are way better ways to deal with stress than to smoke a cigarette. And there are way better and safer ways to help your sleep than taking a drug that possibly could cause suicide ideation or activation or liver damage and all the other issues. It's an addictive product. But I mean, what we just talked about, like these studies, this is why the FDA can't reschedule marijuana out of Schedule 1 because it doesn't have a medical indication. They can't. There isn't one. Show it to me. There isn't there isn't a study that they can use. And so, we're going to find out soon if the FDA reschedules this thing, which they're doing that because they want the banks, right? The American pot industry wants access to the banking systems. But it's just, it's just this, that that marijuana gets this free pass, that it's just this harmless drug. And yet you and I both know all the people that, drug driving kills. We know of all the harms to DNA and everything else. And I always get upset when people talk about, well, no one's saying children should use it or it's about, no, it's about the 80-year-old using it or the 70-year-old or the 60-year-old who, this is a highly addictive product. Contaminated as all get out if you buy it in certain places with all kinds of metals and all kinds of stuff. And it's just got this really high risk profile for heart and stroke.
Yep, absolutely.
All kinds of things.
We could drill down into all this data, and look, I'm loving this conversation. But what I want to do is try to drag us back into the kind of some of the outcomes that we're seeing in Canada, because for me, it's all that you've just said, Pam. Couldn't agree more. And the evidence is on our website as best we can as educators and advocates as well. It's very clear of the harms, and some of the irreparable harms of this product is just quite frightening. And again, in the public square, and again, I think it was we've spoken on this on many occasions, but Alexander the Great, interestingly enough, created this strategy. He realized that he could conquer by force, but he couldn't govern by force. So he created 2 things that helped him keep everyone in line. One currency, so there's only one currency you can use now. A currency now is information. The other one is the same language. This is the normalization factor. You have one language, and you control the public square with a language. And this is what's happening with the propaganda. And, of course, as you've mentioned, the Open Society's investment in this space is it's deluged by this group. But anyway, look, the last 5 years, just quickly, we've indicated that there's basically the regulations and the caveats that were initially put in place were removed quite quickly. Tell us some of the things, I mean, that you've talked about, and I looked at some of the stats here. I won't go into them right now, but traffic incidents in Canada are just off the chart, But what are some of the manifestations that you're seeing from all demographics and cohorts about since legalization has been put in play?
Well, I think, it's part of this bigger conversation about what our societies are becoming, and it's this great divide, right? This great opposition, and it's us versus them. I mean, I think it's really interesting. They call themselves cannabis culture. There's a culture of against us. They're against bureaucracy. They're against the police. They're against authority. They're against rules. They're against science, right?
Yeah,
They're against truth. They're into, and so I think that's the most glaring thing I've noticed in our society, and I would say in the American society, is it's played into this narrative of divisiveness. And I think that this whole sort of woke movement, this whole thing that there'll be books written for many hundreds of years about this whole era.
There will be.
It's all part of it. And now it's just one more way to divide us, I think. And I just think that that's really, really sad. The discourse has become so hot and heavy. And I saw it way back when we first started this, you probably saw this too. Like, I was sitting at the UN ODC meetings and they would glare at you. Like, they would glare at me. Like, they would, and that meeting I told you I went to where with the health minister, everybody, they glared at me. They were rude to me.
Yeah.
They called me names. They said things. These are academics and politicians.
Yes.
And they were like, so I think that's, David Musto, the great narcotics historian who's now deceased, but he said that this will all turn around when people connect dots and see the damage, when the damage shows up. But see, the pot lobby has done very, very good job of keeping the dots from being connected. The science, they come at us. We have a piece of science and they come at us. So I don't know if that's going to play out over time, that the dots will be connected and the public. But the public also see people who use marijuana and they maybe see them dropping out of school, or they see them killing somebody in a car accident, or they see them having fertility issues, like with male, fertility issues, or having repeated spontaneous abortions because their partner smokes marijuana and they happen to read that literature, or someone like myself might mention something. So, the public, I think, are starting to see that. And it's up to us. Of course, the media have been against us too. So to get the word out, it's been incredibly difficult. Like, when I was working on that University of Washington study takedown, I was able to get into USA Today, one of the biggest American newspapers.
Yes.
That was a major coup. But it's very, very hard to get media. It's very hard.
It's even harder in Australia. Trust me on that.
So I think, it's this divide in our society, and I think marijuana is part of it. And I used to, when I was at the beginning, and it was cannabis culture, like they identify.
Yeah, that's right.
Against us. And I think that I think there's something's happening. I hope it is culturally, that this is turning around. And so I think that that's part of this whole world of drugs and us against them mentality, that we've got to find a way to get that to calm down.
I think we will. I think I'll jump in on that because I wanted to. I know that Canada, the Canadian government have, with this desire to bring prevention back into the public square, have engaged with Planet Youth, which is it's a good program, but unfortunately it's a culture shifting program, and unless the culture is ready to use the entire culture shifting matrix that they have in play, it won't work. They tried it in Australia. They brought Planet Youth to Australia, and all they did was say, "Oh, okay." The thing they took out of Planet Youth was, let's give all our indigent children, or our kids that are out of school, give them recreational cards, and give them pamphlets saying, "Hey, be careful when you use drugs because you might hurt yourself." That's kind of all they got out of that. And so that's a concern for me. Culture shift requires much more than information and a few activities. It requires a lot from top down and bottom up. Don't want to go into that. When we start drilling into that space, we'll be here for another hour about culture wars and all that sort of stuff. But just a couple of questions before we go, and I realize the time here, Pam. Loving the conversation. Really important, and it's going to be great listening for anyone who chimes in. But here's a hypothetical for you. If you were to get a sympathetic ear from politicians and policymakers in Australia, like as a whole cohort of Australian politicians and policymakers came to you and said, we really can see the problem with this, about legalization being a problem, what would you say to them? What would be your takeaway? I know it's a big question, but what would be your takeaway line for them to say, wow, yeah, that works. That makes sense.
I wrote a paper about this, and I had a lot of people sign it, including Dr. Bertha Madras from Harvard, and
Yes.
Dr. Philip Seaman, who was nominated for a Nobel Prize in Science. I had them read my paper. You need to put marijuana in a REMS program. That's all you need to do. It all has to go in a REMS program. Thalidomide is in a REMS program. You can use thalidomide for leprosy. Thalidomide is a drug. Can still be used for certain situations, but it's in a REMS program. In Canada, we call it a Rev Aid, but in America, they call it a REMS. I'm not sure in Australia. What it means is you can have marijuana or pot for medical purposes. I never call it medicinal pot. There's no such thing. It's marijuana for medical purposes. You put it because the public wants that, and there's a sort of that it's there. You have it. You have people accessing marijuana for legally for medical purposes, right?
Correct.
So
yep.
We put it under a REMS. What that means is it's like thalidomide. It's identified as a drug that has reproductive health consequences and so you have to screen anybody who's using it for mental health, substance health abuse, heart, stroke, maybe liver, and reproductive health. All men have to be counseled to use condoms, and all women who want to use marijuana for medical purposes have to be told about the consequence of pregnancy and told not to use it if they want to start a family. And then what you do is they're tracked. They're allowed to have this product if they're in a REMS program like thalidomide. They track these people, and then they collect the data, and that's what we need. We need the data.
Beautiful.
So it's not that hard. I was on a call the other day with a pro-pot, very pro-pot pharmacist in California. And I said to her, I put a question in the chat box because she was like lying through her teeth. But I just said, what do you think of putting it under a REMS program? And she went, oh, that's a good idea. And I went, okay. So we might be able to sell it to the pot people. But what they don't understand is that eliminates the major pot people.
Pretty much.
So it's heart for marijuana, heart, stroke, have to check you're okay, liver function, check, pregnancy, any chance you're getting pregnant, men, any chance you're going to have a kid, and any substance abuse background. And, we make a list of the things that are highly the most, right? And if you go through all those checks, well, okay. But then we got to get your data. How are you doing? We have to retest you in these things. There you go.
Yeah, no, good idea.
Because then the user gets educated too. You can sit down and say, yes, you can have it. But you need to know that if you're a male and you're going to father a child, that child could have DNA damage that's generational.
Correct. And that data has to be in the marketplace. And after this session I did with these probus groups, as there was one person in that particular meeting gathering, quite a large gathering, whose adult son was on it and thought it was the best thing ever for his anxiety. And so she'd bought that based on the anecdote. And we actually sat down, Karen Randall and I, get this, 2019, we sat down, we brought her out and to Australia. We did a cannabis tour of Australia, talked to politicians who would listen to us. And there was a number who did. And we sat down with one politician in a particular state here, senator in his office. And he would listen to us. But he's, in the end, and I'm going to just do the short version of this, in the end he said, I hear what you're saying, but my chief of staff, my researcher, is fully convinced that cannabis cured his daughter of cancer, that I have to run with his narrative. And Karen spoke to this. We spoke to this guy in office. He was sitting there fuming. He said, cannabis cured my daughter of cancer. And she said, well, so she had no surgery? Oh, yes. She had no chemotherapy? Oh, yes. She had no rare? Oh, yes. But cannabis cured her. And so enamored was the daughter with how she felt about herself. And this is what I'm saying. I feel better, but I'm getting worse. That this researcher then informs the senator that this is the wonder drug. So this is what we're dealing with. But what you've just said, I think, is really powerful.
Put it in a REMS and
Yeah,
You dealt
exactly.
with them.
Put it in the. That's what I'm saying. That's why I shared that story.
We did it for thalidomide. We do it for thalidomide. We do it for all kinds of other drugs. It's just a strict drug protocol. That's all. It's just that's what it
Correct.
is. It's screening, and that's what you do. And but when I was at the UN ODC in Vienna, and I was asked a couple of things, and I just sat through a lecture from Kiwanis America talking about how we need to educate our children, and I couldn't help myself, but I had to say it, and I was allowed to ask a question, which was great. And I said, I want you to tell me honestly, do you really believe that we can educate a 12-year-old to go up against Big Pot? Do you really believe you can equip a child to go up against Starbucks marketing machine?
Yeah.
Really? You can't leave it to educating children to protect themselves.
No.
You have to be the adult in the room, and you have to protect children. You can't put that on kids. I'm sorry.
Perfect. And on that note, I'm going to ask you our last question for the day. We ask this of pretty much every visitor we have with us, every guest, Pam. Okay, fence or ambulance? Which one do you think's better?
Fence or ambulance?
Fence.
What do you mean?
Fence at the top of the cliff or ambulance at the bottom of the cliff? Which is a better option?
Oh, well, fence, obviously.
Okay, not obvious for some. Okay, but that's and why fence? Because
well, it protects people from falling off the cliff.
Correct. Okay, well, again, we've had different answers, and some people are very much into ambulance. We don't want fences of prevention. We talk about fences of protection. We don't build fences we don't build fences to prevent people from doing things. We build fences to protect them from harm. And so that's interesting. That's an important thing. So the fence is always the key. Yeah. Hey, Pamela McColl, wonderful. Thanks for your insights. And again, clearly we could spend hours talking to you about the journey, the 5-year journey before legalization, and just a quick dive into the 5-year review of cannabis legalization in Canada. And clearly it's as we suspected, despite the reporting and the public face of this. This is a disaster and a mess, and it's only going to be a greater mess as we move forward. Pam McColl, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you all again next time on the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.